Good evening. I'm David Hartwell, and I'm moderating this panel this evening. This is a discussion of climate change. The three panelists are passionately involved in this in one way or another. Paolo Bacigalupi is an award-winning science fiction writer whose fiction tends to focus a lot on climate change in one aspect or another. Elizabeth Kolbert, Betsy Kolbert, is a nonfiction writer who has written a good book on the subject, and in the latest issue of New Yorker, an interesting essay on the population aspect of climate change and the interactions. Kim Stanley Robinson is the science fiction writer who has spent most time in his career over the last 25 years writing books that involve speculations on climate change. I'm going to ask each of them to spend a moment introducing themselves further if they think there's any information the audience should have in addition. And then I'm going to pose them a question and start the discussion. Paolo?
All right. My name is Paolo Bacigalupi. I have been writing science fiction for probably the last, 20 years now. It adds up, but only successfully publishing and selling novels for about the last 5. I previously used to work for an environmental newspaper called High Country News, as well as their online editor. Most of my fiction focuses on either environmental or social sustainability issues.
My name is Betsy Kolbert. I know half of you in the room tonight, so I'm not gonna say much. Yeah, exactly. I got my clack here.
I'm Stan Robinson, and I am a science fiction writer, often interested in the relationships between people and their places, their environments, their planets, and so that has gotten me interested in this topic one way or another for a long time. It's true what David said.
Then to start, I would like to pose a question to allow each of the panelists to talk for a few moments. And I think, if I may, I'll start at the end with Stan. What aspect of climate change do you feel most passionately about at the moment?
Well, I live in the Central Valley of California. I spend as much time as I can in the high Sierra Nevada of California. And so I think there's 2 parts that I can talk about in brief. One would be, I don't like the idea that I'm in the last generation of people that will be able to experience the Sierra Nevada in a healthy state. Is one of the clearest aspects of climate change and the global warming will be less of a snowpack in the Sierra Nevada by significant amounts, and that will wreck the biome that is adapted to that space, which is fragile, being at high altitude. And so going from local to global, I guess the other thing that frightens me, because you can't really get back from, is essentially a mass extinction event, the 6th great mass extinction event in Earth's history, and the first one human-caused, that sits there as a potential, and we can't go backwards from extinctions. And I think mostly of the big mammals, the big wild mammals, which is really just, again, a personal response, but you're talking about passions here.
Yeah.
That the loss of these other, what Muir called our horizontal brothers and sisters, when we can't recover them, that I find very frightening.
Betsy?
Well, I think it's hard to top Stan. I think another aspect, I guess, that I would add, which gets at the extinction event, which I also agree is the biggie here, and which I actually have a book coming out on soon, is what's happening to the oceans, which is not only climate change, but the whole chemistry of the oceans is changing. That's sort of the sometimes called climate change's equally evil twin, and I don't think it's gotten nearly as much attention as it deserves, but it is a truly, potentially unprecedented event in Earth history. The Earth's climate has changed in the past, usually not this fast, But the ocean chemistry is very, very hard to change. It's really not something you can change easily, and we are doing that right now because of all the CO2 we're dumping in the air. So I think that is very scary.
Paulo?
Okay, when I'm thinking about climate change, the thing that's actually interesting to me is essentially the stories that we can't or don't readily perceive because we don't really understand how many different things are all tied to climate, how much of our prosperity is tied to stable climate and a predictable climate. And so a lot of what interests me most is the idea of sort of synergistic catastrophe. Not just one thing going wrong, oh gee, the sea levels are rising, but many, many different pieces all stressing our, and I think in terms of human systems mostly, oh gee, you know, some animal dies, whatever. Except for that we're connected to all of these things and we depend upon them in a variety of mostly invisible to us ways. And so when we're talking about ocean acidification, okay, here's one layer of stressors. Okay, there's a food supply stressor that goes through the entire system. And then you talk about drought in the Southwest, and you say, oh, okay, here's another stressor on food supplies as we lose certain abilities to grow crops reliably. You say, oh, gee, if there's early freezes, late thaws, if there are freak freezes, things like that can change and just sort of surprise us at the wrong moments. That's interesting to me. Right now I'm writing a novel about drought, and one of the things that was very interesting to me about Texas's drought was that over the last couple of years is that it's not only about farms drying up or it's not even about towns running out of water, but that it also turns out it's about hydroelectric capacity. It turns out that they just have less energy because they don't have water in their reservoirs. And so those additive sort of this goes wrong plus this, plus this, plus this, those are the things that really fascinate me about climate because it just turns out so many things are sort of desperately interconnected, and so I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, I have a personal interest. I have a home in the Adirondacks and went to a presentation from Paul Smith's college on the date of freeze-over in the winter. They've been measuring it since 1970, and on the average, fall lasts 44 days longer than it did in 1970. This means an entire third generation of wood borer beetles in the Adirondack forest, for one thing. It also has many, many other implications for everything up to and including tourism. Given the fact that you have all devoted parts of your lives to raising consciousness about this in public, what is the next step other than continuing to raise consciousness? Is there one?
Do I have to go first? I have been watching the scientific community attempt to deal with their initial flag waving about this issue being ignored by the culture at large, which I think in their, I'm going to generalize here, in their political naivete, they thought that when they told the world about this problem, the world would respond. And so when they didn't, this has taken some processing on the part of the scientific community. On the other hand, they're not ignoring it. They've seen what's happened so far and have been unimpressed, and they can't really respond well as individual scientists without breaking what they think of as scientific integrity, and so they continue to work through their associations and their institutions. And as those get more vehement in their descriptions of what could go wrong and the necessity of quick action, I think we're going to have interesting political moments along the way. I think we need to admit that we don't charge enough for everything that we use in this culture, and that there's this systemic underpricing because we don't we externalize the environmental costs and pass them down the line to further generations. So in classical economics, this is called dumping. If you sell something for less than it costs you to make it in order to drive your competition out of business, then this is either called dumping or predatory dumping, which is a lovely phrase. It's so ugly and pointed. And so predatory dumping is what we do as a civilization right now, and then it's usually done to drive competitors out of business, and in this case the competitors are the future generations. And they're very easy to beat in a competition because they're not here yet to defend themselves. So systemic predatory dumping, this is what we do. So one of the things you would do is then charge a carbon tax. And this is simple and effective. And you could say that the carbon tax will then be, they say this already, given right back to the people who have paid the tax as individuals so that it doesn't get sequestered into various private interests of one sort or another, and essentially start paying the true costs of what we're putting in the atmosphere. And that would change behaviors. So you could, in other words, try to use ordinary capitalist economics, which in so many ways is a lie and cheat, against the problem itself. Because if we're ordered to solve capitalism as well as climate change, even though the two are intertwined, we have to use the one as a tool against the other, and then they both will change. So I guess I would talk about it in these terms. Try to use conventional economic terms to describe the problem and the solution, and admit that we need a carbon tax and a regulation of our economy, which of course is very controversial.
I'd just like to know why you hate America.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes. The man wants to raise taxes, doesn't he? Yeah, right.
Tax and spend.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the luxuries of being a journalist is that you don't have to answer questions like that. So obviously everything that Stan says is absolutely what anyone who's studied this problem would say. We've got to have a price on carbon. That's the first step. It's not necessarily a sufficient step, but it's the only step that we know how to take that will have a significant impact, that we think will have a significant impact. How you get that accomplished politically, a lot of people are thinking about this, but unfortunately a lot more people are thinking about how to not get it accomplished politically, or are not thinking about it at all. I should say there's a big chunk of the world that's not thinking about it at all. Then there's a big chunk of the world with a very, very serious, obvious financial interest in pumping as much fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them as possible. And we see all over this country. There's a couple of trends going on. We just got the latest greenhouse gas figures for the states from the IEA, I think it was today or yesterday, and emissions are down about 4% over their high. Part of that is warm winters, ironically or not ironically enough. Part of that is a switch from coal to natural gas, which is being driven by this huge fracking boom that we're seeing in many, many parts of the country. And part of it is auto efficiency standards that the Obama administration has. That's one of the few things that they have done that has really starting to have an impact. So the trend lines are in the states are they're better than they were, down as opposed to up, but the question of it's just not fast enough, not nearly enough, and very fragile. If any of those trends turned around, they would turn around. And then in the rest of the world, the trend is very significantly up, tracking the very highest greenhouse gas scenarios that the IPCC even tracked. Now those things seem too low. So we're going to hit a lot of these milestones way sooner than people were predicting as recently as 10 years ago.
Okay, so and the question is what do we do after we're done raising consciousness? I feel like honestly there's still a layer of consciousness that sort of needs to be raised, and I feel like it sort of centers around the idea that there are profit interests who are actively working against our long-term interests, I think about this in two sort of very specific ways. One of them is that I feel like things like climate change are a form of generational warfare. We are without question, as adults, attacking our children. Every day you get in a car, you're putting a gun to your kid's head, bang. The kids can't fight back. And our convenience is more important than their future. And I feel like that's actually worth emphasizing again and again and again, because it hasn't quite caught that how amoral our present behavior is. And we hate being told that we're amoral, but I mean, I'm sorry. But there's this other layer though where I think about like how a profit-driven capitalist system works, where its entire system is structured around the idea that we have to nail our next quarterly profits report, and how how responsive people are to those kinds of pressures, to stock market pressures, to pricing pressures, and the fact is like we have an entire system that's built around the idea of encouraging people to be short-sighted and stupid about our future. And it's like I still sort of feel like I'm trying to pull that apart in a way that's actually makes it explicable to people. That it's like, and the closest thing that I've come up to these days is that the major corporations are a bit like H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu. They're these undying monsters that have these insatiable appetites, and we can worship in front of them, and they'll give us some things, but eventually we'll be consumed. And it's like the closest thing, because they just are not. We've sort of created this idea that corporations in many ways are real entities that deserve some respect, and it's like we've built these monsters. So I don't know. I still sort of feel like there's a process of trying to get our heads around a different narrative that's still necessary before we can even start making rational decisions, because it's sort of this weird thing is that we know exactly what we need to do to fix this problem. There are all the tools are there and available, and that's the part that's so astonishing, is that okay, if we create a carbon tax, okay, if we know that this year gas is going to be 25 cents more expensive than last year, and the year after that it's 25 cents more expensive, and if you have consistent pricing signals, the market absolutely will adapt. It will unlock an immense amount of innovation. As long as those pricing signals are consistent and we can anticipate that in 10 years this is going to be the price of gas, wow, you're going to see a lot of changes. And yet we will not engage with that. And that's, I just sort of feel like that's because once again, you're stuck back in here we are in our selfish selves, not caring about that future generation. For whatever we discount our children's lives, and we weight our own lives and our own convenience above all. I don't know.
No, I did not mean to imply that there was no longer anything worthwhile in raising consciousness.
No, I just.
I think we need to have the unremitting pressure of that kind of work in as much in the foreground as possible, for as long as possible, for as long as it takes, and that we have to find ways to keep the attention of the public and engage the attention of the public in the fact that there is not just a problem, but a global problem, a complex problem, an inconvenient problem, and a deadly problem. My son wants to grow up, my 16-year-old son wants to grow up to, work with animals. And he was talking to an oceanologist who said, well, don't think about the oceans, because by the time you're my age, there'll be nothing left but squids and jellyfish. I said, well, that's a pretty negative thing. He said, I don't see any way around it. That's a horrifying thought. I hope he was exaggerating. He didn't believe he was exaggerating, though. Do you want to engage in discussion of this, or ask questions, or ask challenges? You can ask each other questions, or we can ask the audience questions. What do you think?
What else can be said? I'm trying to think what can be useful or hopeful in this situation, as I always am. And the thing is that there is reason for hope and action, because you can actually do the calculations and say, essentially, is it too late? And then this is really a devastating question. when you ask it that way, because either way the answer isn't helpful. If you say, is it too late for us to do anything about climate change, and you say, no, it isn't too late, then you think, well, I don't have to do anything yet. But if you say, on the other hand, if you say, well, yes, it's too late, well, then there's nothing you can do, so you don't do anything then either. So in essence, that question leads to inaction. So you have to flip that question, and you can do the calculations and say, if we were to do everything to reduce carbon that is physically possible right now, given that our infrastructure, our power systems, our transport systems run on burning carbon, if we did everything as best we could, would we hold to the 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperature that has been calculated to be the maximum rise that would keep us from going into jungle planet mode and a full-on mass extinction event? It actually is still technically possible. We can burn about 1 trillion tons of carbon before that happens, and since the Industrial Revolution began, we have burned about 500 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And that 1 trillion tons at our current rate of burn, or even at the current acceleration of burn, will be accomplished by the year 2040. So all these things are relatively clear, and yet we could reduce the burn quickly enough to get to that point by applying the full effort of everything that has been suggested. Now that includes some stuff that environmentalists are very uncomfortable with, like fracking, like nuclear power plants that burn the waste down, and so there isn't as much waste, but there's an incredibly great bomb-grade uranium, plutonium at the end of the process. That includes genetically modified organisms combined with organic agriculture in ways that haven't even been invented yet, and things that will freak out and make very angry my brothers and sisters on the left, because there's already a received wisdom that these would be bad things. Almost always the attacks on these things are attacks against capitalism that have been category errored away to attacks on the things themselves. So that genetic engineering is no different than the breeding we've been doing since we've been human beings, except the scissors are better, and yet we attack it, but what we're attacking is the ownership of the natural world by corporations. What we don't like in it is capitalism, not genetic engineering. This happens over and over again, and yet we're in a planetary crisis having to do with saving the environment from a mass extinction event. We have to throw out a lot of our comfortable ideas that came to us rather inexactly and fuzzily from hippie thought of the 1960s. And as a hippie from the 1960s, I can fully say some of those ideas were wrong and need to be rethought. And we need to use science like a tool in this situation to tweak the political system and the economic system. So I'm sorry to, I'm trying to like squish everything that I would say into 5 minutes to see if we can lead into certain things.
I've actually got a question. I mean, sometimes you hear the idea that there's a sort of a techno solution. There's a techno utopianist solve to all of this. Right. We're gonna hit some sort of crux point with solar power or something like that, and we'll be able to sort of flip the switches very quickly, or some other technical innovation will sort of rescue us. I'm curious about what you guys think about those ideas, and whether or not there are any technical sort of movements that you think are interesting or exciting, or even hopeful, or if that's actually just a sort of a weird sort of pipe dream.
I think that the really profound problem from my point of view is that, yes, I do think that there are probably some very cool technologies coming down. I mean, solar power is coming way down, and there's a lot of sunlight that hits the earth, and many people have said if you just capture a very small fraction of that, we can power what we do. I think that one of the problems that you run up against, and this is sort of what Stan is saying, but I think I come at it from a somewhat different perspective, is all of these things have planetary change associated with them. Nothing comes for free. Nuclear power doesn't come for free. There's a lot of, you can't have nuclear power. I'm going to say you can't ramp up nuclear power without ramping up nuclear accidents. I think that's just an obvious, sort of truism. Now that you may say that's a risk we want to take, because the alternative is worse, and that's quite possible. It's a reasonable argument to have, maybe. But I think that in terms of looking at the rest of the planet and not just people, even ramping up solar power and taking over the deserts, with solar panels, all of these things have impact. So I don't think there's anything that's going to come along that's just going to magically save us from impacting the planet. There are too many of us, and we use too much energy. Now, could we radically scale back what we're doing? We've never had 7.2 billion people on the planet before. We don't have anything to look back on. So there is definitely a backwards-looking, sort of strand in a lot of utopian thought. We're going to go back. We're going to become local. We're going to live more simply. And I think those are all also very potentially valuable ideas. But it's not entirely clear to me, that you can support 7.2 billion people living locally. All these things just have never been done. We're going to find out a lot of these things by trial and error. That's what we're doing right now, trial and error on the planet. But it's not clear to me that there's some, even if you had a brilliant new technology, that it would solve this problem.
Because we think of technology as being machinery, we sometimes get caught up in that solar panel, beams from space, various machinery systems. And I want to insist that technology also includes our software, and I always want to remind everybody that therefore law is a technology, and therefore you can think of justice as a technology, because it's the software that runs the system, and that 7.2 billion people alive on this planet is an extremely artificial system, and it only works because of the software. It's amazing it works even as good as it does. But that is interesting, because Betsy just published this great article, a review article in the New Yorker on population itself. And everybody at this point in her high school education ought to be taught that impact on the planet is the IPAT formula. It's population times appetite times technology. So it's how much we consume as an individual person, because an individual American is consuming 30 times as much as somebody in the developing world living a peasant lifestyle. And then also technologies can be either clean or dirty. And so you're never going to have a pure technological bullet solution, but once you get that formula in place, you begin to run all the factors. Population is still important. But wherever you get social justice and wherever women have their full set of human rights as described by the UN Declaration of Rights, which every nation has signed on to, the population rate, the total replacement rate, or whatever TPF that Betsy described, drops to even below replacement rate, because it's the women that matter, and they tend to have less than 2 kids per mom when they have their full set of legal rights and property rights. So in other words, you could say by expanding women's rights universally across this planet, as we've agreed to in the UN, we no longer have a population growth problem, because it'll stabilize on its own without any government orders whatsoever, but from individual choices, which is a good thing. So there you have justice as an environmentalist technology, because you solved the P part of the IPAT formula. Then appetite, that's the locavore thing, that's values, that's tightly wound into values and lifestyles. Cultural change happens really fast. The difference between 1978 and 1982 was vast. The difference between 1928 and 1934 was vast. So cultural change pretty fast. And then the technologies, now that's hard, because you've got path dependency, and you've got infrastructures built to last for 50 years that are dirty, and we depend on it. So swapping out that infrastructure is not like the Apollo program. It's more like World War II itself, a massive industrial effort by everybody. But it also, swapping out technologies is something we do normally as a civilization. So it's not freakish. It's just the ordinary shift from dirty tech to clean tech. I mean, at least, and it can be directed. So I think there is consciousness raising involved in just making these issues clear enough that we can begin to discuss them and do both risk assessment and risk management. Because say a nuclear accident is a risk, but what if the US Navy was running all the nuclear power in the United States? They've been doing a nuclear program in tiny little boats and in weird situations for 65 years now with well, only a few minor accidents, but very few accidents. Okay.
better than most
lose
accidents.
a bomb here or there, but as far as the submarines have never blown up. So I think that this is a place where you say, well, we might need nuclear power. It's not pure. It's not. It even takes carbon burn, and yet it wouldn't be putting carbon in the atmosphere. Let's do nuclear for one more generation and then get rid of it forever, and let's let the government run it instead of private industry trying to make a profit out of it and cutting corners.
Why do you hate America? Okay, okay, I've got a question for you guys, and I mean, we're all storytellers. You work in narrative nonfiction, we work in fiction, and I guess one of the things that sort of strikes me about this is like that it feels like a lot of times when I'm working with my stories, I'm trying to figure out some way to sort of hack sort of human values to make us think in a different way or feel about something in a different way. Right now the narrative sort of goes with dealing with almost all environmental issues is, well, tough luck, you have to make do with less, and that's the only way to, if you put on your hair shirt, maybe we can make it or something like that, which is a very unattractive narrative. Not sexy. But I sort of wonder about like this, what's the process of finding, like, I mean, it sort of feels like you were talking a little bit about the stories that we tell ourselves about what do we have too much, are we out of time, or do we still have time? That's a narrative sort of question mark that then we can build a story around in our own heads. Oh, do I need to do anything right now, or is it too late, or maybe I can just kick it a while longer? And I'm sort of wondering about like what you guys think about, what narrative would we want to have in our heads to make the idea of a sustainable future attractive?
You're the fiction writer. Yeah, I mean, I think that the advantage that fiction has obviously is that you can have people moving through time. So the problems that nonfiction writers have dealing with the sort of situation, I'll call it the situation that we're in, is that it's prospective. So far everyone sitting in this room would say, well, I noticed climate change. We just had our first frost last night. That was really late. If you look at, probably historical records, which I haven't done, I suspect it was very late for the Berkshires to be getting its first frost on October 22nd. But, you go to Stop and Shop and there's a lot of food there, and, everything seems absolutely fine. So what's the big deal? And that's a very, very difficult, narrative to break through. So, you guys can move people through time and space and get to a different place that could be apocalyptic, or it could be, wonderful. And I think that that's incredibly important because people, aren't sort of getting there, on their own and need a little imaginative nudge there.
I feel like when I read your writing, one of the things that you do is that you unearth a narrative that I don't have in my head. Oh, my supermarket's stocked, everything is fine. And then here's this other narrative. Oh, well, have you ever heard of ocean acidification and why you might be really worried? And, it's the hidden narrative that's going to actually, guide everything. That moment when your series on global warming, I remember reading it initially in the New Yorker and then getting your book later. And here's a narrative that seems to be overarching, even as my daily life feels pretty good. Hey, I'm making more money than I did last year. Things are awesome. And yet there's this other, so I mean you are sort of like working with this sort of implanting some other story in our head. Oh, here's a warning light on the dashboard, as opposed to oh, things are fine, even though your physical signals around you might be saying things are fine. Here's another set of warning lights. You just didn't go far enough out to look. That's something that strikes me a lot about especially science journalism and science reporting is.
Yes, but I feel, and I'd be interested to hear what the audience, that sort of string has been played out. I mean, I think if you're interested in climate change, that sort of, and there's definitely like a techno thriller, kind of aspect to that, like looking into the future, which is what many thrillers are about, and not so good. And rushing to sort of save that plane before it falls out of the sky. But like if you've been paying any attention, for the last decade, you've sort of you've seen those there's one as they're screaming, and just what do you do next? How do you get people's attention next? And I haven't figured that out, so I'm gonna leave it.
Do you feel like you're outgunned by other industries and their messaging and stuff like that? Do you feel like I mean, for every every dollar that, say, the New Yorker spends sending you around to go report, like, how many dollars does ExxonMobil spend to make people feel a little more confused about whether global warming exists, or even, it's whose responsibility it is, or things like that.
And
Do you take that personally at all? I don't know. I was just wondering.
No, and it's even more. I mean, and you're not just up against ExxonMobil. To be honest, you're up against Miley Cyrus. I mean, she's not pushing you to consume fossil fuels, but she's pumping something out, and it's not. Let's seriously consider what we're doing here. So I think that But it has ever been thus, and I don't want to say. I think we are in a weirdly, Colin Murphy wrote this book, Are We Rome? We are in this weird, bread and circuses moment, in my view, where a lot of, and climate change is just one, I would argue, the major one, but just one of many things. It's not
one of the Goths.
Exactly. One of the tribes descending on us. But once again, that is like time will tell. Time will tell us. Many of us in this room will not be around to see the answer to that, but we don't know the answer to that yet. And so there's definitely this kind of like beating the same drum quality.
Paolo and I were talking in advance about how much we piggyback off of Betsy's work and the work of science journalism like that, and that we need coherent narratives out of the sciences to summarize, and you've done some of the best work done in this field in that way, and so then we can make stories based off of that. In other words, future scenarios, science fiction stories that are set in futures that are paying attention to important components because of the stuff that we learn from you, which is really compacting the science community's information. And again, I come back to science, and I've been characterizing our giant civilizational battle as a kind of a Hindu gods battling each other, science versus capitalism. And this is very Manichaean, and it's very simplistic, like a Punch and Judy puppets. But I nevertheless think that I'm onto something here, big in our civilization. Science is our attempt to understand the world and to get more comfortable in it. It started in medicine. It's often been co-evolving with warfare, so it's by no means pure, but nothing's pure. But this scientific effort is what got us 7.2 billion people on this planet, and as imperfect as it is, it's a scientific achievement, and has a utopian drive underneath it that can be often subverted. And then capitalism, on the other hand, is basically liquidified or residual feudalism. It has a pyramid of wealth and privilege. It has the 1% powerful and the managerial class that gets by okay, and it can be split down very easily into the classes of people that can live off of their capital, the people who are making more, the people who are losing money even though they work, and the utterly impoverished who are not in the game at all. And that exists in capitalism as being perfectly okay. So, and also it wrecks the planet by this predatory dumping and by this Ponzi scheme that it's hilarious but not, that the global economic system is basically a Ponzi scheme in which the future generations are being scammed and are going to end up with the empty bag at the end of the process. And it's also a system that's massively emplaced in that no one nation could decide to become less capitalist, because now it's a globalized system and stronger than any individual nation state. So, a big problem, wrecking the earth, and our descendants are going to be suffering badly. What can fight capitalism best? Well, science, democracy, environmentalism, feminism. These are the forces arrayed against this economic system that we've built that seems like an algorithm. So that when we talk about the singularity and we talk about artificial intelligence, we're usually really talking about the way that we are enthralled to an economic system that we did invent, or history invented, and yet now it's wrecking things, and it seems really, really hard to change. So I tell utopian stories saying that science will win out because there's a part of us that's Mr. Spock and will do the intelligent thing in the end. And it's a story, but right now I think it's the story that you have to tell to make the best effort to keep the fight going.
Yeah, when I'm writing science fiction, I've worked for a long time in sort of the warning sort of layer, where it's like, here's this broken world. Do you like it? Didn't think so. And you can have some pretty excellent adventures inside of completely ripped to pieces broken worlds. But I've sort of felt like that there's this weakness of warning, like that you can beat that drum, and people are like, yep, world's going to hell. And almost that you've built in a mythic inevitability to it. I feel like this is sort of true in the United States when we talk about guns. It's like, I need a gun under the bed in case the robber comes, and it sort of builds this mythic inevitability that first of all the robber is coming, and also that he has to be shot. And there's just this kind of once you've built the story, then it's all that's left is for the puppets to kind of play it out. And so I've started thinking more and more about stories where, what's the myth that you want to live into? And the thing I do like about science fiction is the idea that it's got the potential to build inspirational myths. It's done that with other technologies. If Arthur C. Clarke writes about communication satellites, and then we get them because they're so cool, then that's interesting. And when NASA scientists say, oh yeah, I grew up reading about rocket ships, now I build them. There's this moment where it's like, here's this awesome thing on the page, now I want one, let's go get it. That I see, you see it again and again. Neil Stephen's Snow Crash. The people who read this book about virtual reality, go out and create. Now I'm going to blank on the virtual reality game. Second Life. Thank you. And you see this sort of like, here's this thing, this myth, this idea in a book. I want it. And so there's this feeling that, like, if you can get people to almost believe into something enough, that it almost naturally flows. And I played with this a little bit. Right. Well, and to what is that, like, what does that world look like? I mean, this is that moment when you start thinking about, like, oh, let's talk about a world that has capitalism run differently, or that allows us to sort of label, oh, this is the science part of the equation, and oh, that's the capitalism part of the equation. So that's so quick that we always know when we're getting, the Manichaeanly evil message, and we recognize it right away. I started thinking about that, like, the story has the potential to sort of hack the way we view the world, and then potentially the way we live into it. And I don't have good answers for how to do that because it's complicated and it's undone yet. But I'm interested in it. I feel like I've played with it a little bit, especially with technology, because technology is the easy part. Like, you can kind of get your hands on it. And so I remember when I was writing Shipbreaker, I wanted to write about a sustainable technology. I wanted to make wind power sexy. I wanted sustainable technologies to be awesome. And so I built these amazing clipper ships. They're high technology sailing ships. I want to say, okay, let's have a global economy, but let's base it on sail instead of fossil fuels. And we had a global economy before. And so you can sort of say, oh, okay, like, instead of wooden boats with sails, what would we do now if we ran out of fuels? What would we do now with all of our scientific know-how? What would we do, and how would we use wind now? And so I imagine, sailboats with high-altitude parasails and with hydrofoils, and they're fast and they're sleek, and you can dream about that in a way physically that's very enticing, and then you can make that seem enticing enough that hopefully at some point, somebody says, I want to build one of those. I think that, it's really fun to sort of watch the America's Cup right now and say, what if we took that technology further? Let's keep going. Let's make boats that put stuff in instead of just a few crew members on it, but now, like, I mean, the thing that, like, sort of comes across to me is, like, how do you create a civilization that looks so good you want to live into it, a value set that looks so good you want to live into it in the same mythic sort of way. I mean, that's something I'm puzzling about right now. So, anybody else thinking about that? I don't know. Like, sorry, I'm just ranting, but like, don't mind me. Yeah.
I recommend Paolo's Shipbreaker for this very image, because these sailing ships are a stupendously great solution. Also, we're not going to run out of carbon. We can only burn 500 gigatons. We've already identified 2,500 gigatons that are, we know where they are, and people own them, and profits could be made from them. So we are going to have to actually stop
rein ourselves
when
in
we still know.
Right.
We're going to have to rein ourselves in. The value of what we leave in the ground, I once calculated on the back of an envelope, literally, And so you can't trust this figure, but I did try to run the numbers on it, and it was $160 trillion worth of carbon that needs to be left in the ground. So this is the magnitude of the economics problem, and I think
That's
it keeps
the bait that we're fighting against.
Well,
I want to bite into that money, baby.
At that point, you can't afford to save yourself. We can't afford not to go extinct, and so that speaks to the craziness. The craziness.
Say that again. We can't afford to not. Wait, say it again.
I don't even know what I said, but we need a different economics, don't we? Yes, we need a different economic way of calculating all these things. I mean, Betsy wrote about what if the population does get lower. There are many economists that say, oh, we can't afford that. I mean, it might save the planet, but we couldn't pay for it. Well, it's the economics that is problematic here. Whenever there's a question between physical reality and economics, it's really economics that ought to change.
Yes, and if you want something vaguely hopeful, and I only offer vaguely hopeful things. I think that economists who do not work for fossil fuel companies, I do think that world is changing. I mean, you have people like Hank Paulson now talking about climate change, and so those guys who understand risk and very big risk and who fell victim to very big risk, I think do increasingly quote unquote get it, but the guys who are running the fossil fuel companies, they're not really they're not just sitting there doing calculations. They have something that they have to do. That's what their business is, getting that stuff out of the ground. And how you kind of turn that around from the very small local level, which is there's a lot of communities now that are built on extracting fossil fuels, and our politics are very weirdly, just if you look at where swing states are and swing districts, they're often in coal parts of the world. So just these weird sort of contingent things about American politics make it really, really hard to change the way this ship is moving.
I thought you were starting towards the positive thing.
The positive thing. The positive thing is that other companies, companies that have to manage risk, are seeing climate change as a very, very big risk, and I think we'll increasingly see it as a very, very big risk, because it is a very, very big risk to your bottom line. And so maybe we will see some pushback from those folks.
Like when insurance companies start lobbying as hard as others like to say, oh wait, this is going to cost us, instead of it's going to cost a fossil fuel company or something, that you'll have a competing monetary interest to do battle or something.
Yeah, that's coming in the next year. The insurance rates are going absolutely sky high because of the turbulent climate events.
Well, those are federal insurance. That's our federally subsidized insurance. They're changing all those maps, and people are going to feel it in their pocketbook.
Yeah.
Because we're changing the flood maps. Finally.
Really a lot.
But not explicitly because of climate change. You will see new flood maps.
Just your coastal property just got a lot more expensive.
Yes, but it will never say, and it will never project out forward what's going to happen with sea level rise.
And this is really fascinating to me. Is that I feel like we're still fighting this process to just engage with the idea that reality exists. I mean, there's this strange thing where you kind of feel like reality has become this strange, muddy thing that you keep grabbing at, and that all of these other people have made very, very, it just feels like you're fighting through mud all the time to just describe reality. And I was noticing this at Colorado Drought Conference a little while ago. I live in Western Colorado, and I was over in Denver and sort of snuck in on a drought conference. And it was very, very interesting to listen to these water managers, Denver water manager, some Colorado agricultural managers, different people in government and in small business, and a bunch of different groups who all are interested in water. And Governor Hickenlooper was there, and it was very interesting how everybody skated right past climate change. They could sort of engage with the idea that there was no water in the state, but they couldn't engage with the idea that statistically that's probably our new reality either. Oh, right. And so because they can't say it, they can't engage with it seriously. And one of the things that was fascinating was watching one of the people at Denver Water talk about, okay, well, this is what we do in a drought, and this is when we sort of start doing water restrictions, and this is what we do. This is when we cut back. And I asked him after his presentation. I said, so what will you do if if that drought goes on for longer than 2 years? How long can you guys subsist on your reservoir capacity and stuff? He's like, well, we can probably go 3 years, and then 4 years all the trees are dead. He's like, yeah, we could maybe make it 5 on our reservoir capacity if assuming it was sort of similar to our 2011 drought. We'd get this much recharge each year, not quite enough, so we draw down, not quite enough. We could put in tighter and tighter restrictions. We think we can draw it out about 5 years, and then you're really in a world of hurt. And I said, so what do you feel like the statistical chances of running into that kind of an event are over the next 20 something years? And it was like, well, that math is really hard because there's really no precedent for that. And you sort of pause and you say, well, we are in a sort of unprecedented period, aren't we? And that moment where you think, oh, gee, when the people who are in charge of the water pipes aren't doing the math, they aren't engaging with the reality of risk that we have. Like, that's that moment where you just think, oh my God, we're in free fall. And I sort of still feel like that's sort of one of the things I'm most puzzled about our existence, especially here in the United States, that we've managed to sort of step into some version of reality free fall where we just sort of deny that facts exist, that truth does exist. And I feel like that's almost our biggest problem these days, is just the ability to sort of identify what is a fact. And that's the most bread and circus sort of Rome burning kind of part of the whole thing, to me at least, is that what's real? I don't know.
Yeah. We got 3 or 4 tentative hands out there. Gentleman in the center.
This was probably for Stan, for Paolo. How effective is fiction as a vehicle for persuasion around these issues? And also, what's the risk of doing damage to the quality of your prose if you employ it in that way? Is there at some point your character's going to flatten out?
Didacticism, preaching, ranting. Yeah. Sure. I think there's a high degree of risk that you can drop into a space where you're so preachy, ranty, and didactic that you lose your readers and you actually lose the thread even of your message. That even the most allied person will close the book and say "fuck you." I've certainly felt that way sometimes when I'm reading a book, and and so I think you can turn off even your most dedicated reader if you push it far enough. In terms of the effectiveness. God, I feel so ineffective all the time. I'm not really sure. I do have little moments where I think, oh, maybe this is an interesting experiment after all. I remember there was a graphic design student who got really excited about Shipbreaker and started mocking up CGI designs of what a clipper ship would look like. And this kid had to deal with a whole bunch of question marks that I really could elide in the book. Like, how will this thing balance in the water? And what is its shape? And but he was sitting there with a CAD program and laying this kind of stuff out and so you saw your idea going from something that you sort of made generic and with enough specificity for somebody to kind of imagine and for it to feel exciting, and for somebody else to take it one step further and say, oh yeah, here's some physicality, here's a test version, here's version, beta, 0.00, 1 or something like that. But it was interesting to sort of see that, from your mind to someone else's mind to a design, and that kind of made me think that there's potential.
Stan?
Well, I would speak to say that the existence and success of Paolo Bacigalupi is a sign that you can do consistent political fiction for adults and young adults, and have it be really the most popular science fiction that's come out in the last 5 years, which I find tremendously encouraging. And also, I mean, maybe he's just a freak and an accident. It sometimes seems that way. But it's a great sign, because it's really a generation that has fallen into the kind of fantasy trap of Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, where in fantasy you can identify evil and chop its head off in that kind of fantasy, and that's very comforting for young readers. Whereas in science fiction, you're looking at these futures that are pretty bleak, and so to have a young readership go to this and say, but this is what I like to read, this is the most engaging stuff because it's irrelevant, or who knows why, it's hard to explain, but it's political fiction that's proving to be popular. Maybe there's a desire to get the news about reality, who knows. So, and as for my own part, I mean, I've been writing for an awfully long time, and I'm one of the only serial offenders when it comes to writing utopian fiction more than once, because it's a crazy thing to do. And we have some great utopian writers where you keep on talking about how things might feel for an individual living in a culture where things are better. And this is really interesting to write about and to try. And my Mars books are by far my most popular, and they tell the story of the construction of a sustainable civilization that seems to be getting along pretty well on a planet with a lot of difficulties to live there. Well, this is a very easy allegory for our planet here, which I'm sure is part of the reason for those books' success. In other words, people want that story. There's a hunger for it, and it might be effective in the sense that the young think, well, why are things so messed up? We could do better. And so this is the story you try to tell.
There's a woman 3 rows back, yes.
When you think about that, the unprecedented nature of this problem requires revolutionary and transformational change. I hear your point about how science and economic models should be leading us forward, but that's not really happening. And it's really, Betsy kind of hit the nail on the head with her Miley Cyrus remark. How do we change the zeitgeist? How do we change the consciousness? And what is the role of art and literature? And how can we, do you have any thoughts about how that can sort of lead us forward in transforming how people think about life on this planet? I love what you're doing, but it's very specific, and it's a very specific audience. And do you have any thoughts just more broadly about the role of art and literature?
All right. You're
Let's
wrong.
make Betsy.
Yeah, you're right. We'll point both marks.
What do you read?
When you think about music in the 60s, for example, there's something that comes to mind about how it really captured the zeitgeist. It really, was it a symptom or was it a cause? I don't know, but it clearly, when you look back, you could say that the music of the 60s played a transformational role in bringing people together and creating change. So there's one specific thing that I thought.
I think a lot in terms of the idea of cultural infection, that you want to find something like, whether it, you want something to go viral. You want those memes that, for whatever reason, sort of capture something and then transmit to more people. And I'm not sure what it was during the 60s, for example, that suddenly said, oh, here's a whole bunch of people who are really dissatisfied in certain ways, and it becomes viral. There's these movements that suddenly are happening. And, what are the trigger things that made society sort of receptive to that infection? And then,
Well, in fact, science fiction had a lot to do with it. In fact, if you remember A Stranger in a Strange Land and some other books like that, they were very widely read by the musicians as well.
But I do think in terms of like that you're looking for the slickness and intelligence of the advertising images and the packaged stars that we have, and applying that kind of cleverness to a different set of memes. That's kind of where I think you sort of need to end up in order to successfully really press something out into mass culture.
Mr. Delany.
Yeah, when I hear this kind of discussion, and I've been listening to this kind of discussion for 20 years, if not more, it always seems to me that the one place where it would take a lot of energy, but nevertheless it's the most doable place for intervention, is in terms of the population explosion. That's where it all kind of hinges on. And what you've got to simply do is reverse the population growth. And I hear it talked about, as we even hear today, that that if you give women their rights, suddenly the population goes down below the replacement level. This is the best thing that could happen to any nation. And above and beyond that, the country that can figure out how to dissociate sex from procreation will win. And it's simply that. So as far as Miley Cyrus is concerned, she's the best thing that's happened in a long time. And I'm a gay man. I'm not a straight guy. But I know that what Miley Cyrus is doing is very important, and that's why it's gone viral. We do have a kind of sexual subconscious, and when something important does happen, we all learn about it, and I'd love to hear us talk about why it's important, you know.
Covered it. That's brilliant.
Mr.
Cyrus is the vanguard of birth
Okay,
control.
okay, several more. Mr. Crowley.
I was thinking about, it reminds me, trying to figure out how fiction could address this problem. It reminds me of back in the 1960s, late 60s, the Vietnam War. I talked to Paul Goodman, he was actually an advisor on a film. He said, there's a problem about making anti-war films. It's this film about how bad war was, how evil it is, how it hurts people, and it's useless, and it never comes out the way you want. He says you cannot make an anti-war film about war. War itself is just too exciting and interesting and thrilling and horrible that you cannot do that. What can you do instead of making an anti-war film about war? And it makes me think of what Paolo just said about dystopias, which can be deeply thrilling because everything is at stake, nothing holds you back from fighting for your own self. And they're filled video games, they fill the movies, they are deeply thrilling. And that's horribly dangerous. How do you make a film that is a warning that is not more thrilling than your own ordinary daily existence? How do you do that? The anti-war film that did it, obviously, around that same time was Dr. Strangelove, which made fun of all the people who thought all this stuff was terribly important. They made them all look like idiots. How do you follow that Paul Goodman idea in terms of climate change?
The Strangelove was satire, and satire is an ancient device where you try to laugh at and put a curse on your enemy doing the evil thing, and also try to shame people into different behaviors. And my theory is that after 2,500 years of satire, and we still are behaving horribly, that American culture right now is immune. Or first of all, it doesn't work, but it's beyond satire. And at that moment, you get dystopia, where you say, you know what, we're just screwed, we're just bad, and it isn't funny anymore. So dystopia is not comedy, the way Strangelove was comedy. So I guess, but from the negative point of view, I think, or warning, the dystopian warning, we need that, we've got that, but you also need utopia, and those are going to be more boring, those are going to be more, zoning battles and meetings over changing the laws, and I think you can write those stories, although I'll tell you, it's a puzzle, and you lose sleep over it because you are deliberately writing stuff that is fundamentally not thrilling, but is in fact is a zoning code meeting at the local board. I've written that scene. And, oh my God, I've gone mad to write such a thing. But what I would like to see, though, is speculative economics. Economics is a captured field. It's legal analysis. It's not physics. It's not a science. It's a form of legal analysis. It's a form of law. And it's a form of power domination. That's economics. Well, where's speculative economics? We need reformist or revolutionary economics, people writing these systems. Now, there are some people, but I would like to see the people with the training to do the cost-benefit analysis, to do the pricing, to do, like the great centerpiece of capitalist economics is competitive equilibrium, CE, that there's essentially supply and demand will come into a balance where the price is right. Now, this is a complete lie, because the person selling something will sell it, the person buying something wants it at the cheapest price possible. The person selling it has to live through the next business cycle and therefore has to sell it as cheaply as they can get away with, and so they'll cheat, and they'll cheat on the future to give the lowest price they can. So competitive equilibrium is not ecological. It's a part of the Ponzi scheme. And yet it's fundamental to capitalist economics. It's their big centerpiece saying this is the market. When they talk about the market, they mean this, that prices will be sane by a free exchange of trade. But the seller's always in a terrible position compared to the buyer, and the buyer is always a cheapskate because you need to get as much as you can for the little that you have. So this is our economic system. How do we change it? The economists, talk to us. And then they all say,
okay, hey, got one.
yeah.
An economist, an environmentalist, I'm also the chairman of the Center for Environmental Studies. Economics is not the enemy. You talked about the software, our laws and our regulations, and you're absolutely right. The way that our economic system functions is that prices drive the allocation of resources. If the prices are wrong, the allocation of resources will be wrong, will be harmful to us. And so the answer really isn't to somehow do away with economics. Economics is not an evil thing. And read, people like John Stuart Mill, political economy will not make you bad, But
Not saying that.
But we need the right prices, and so the answer is to have better governance and more forward-thinking governance to create the institutional framework within which market activity will give us good outcomes, not bad outcomes. And economics is a tool in exactly the same way that science is a tool. And I would go a step further, and I would say capitalism, which you have described as somehow in this Manichaean framework being evil, capitalism is a tool. It is not inherently evil. It is not the source of environmental degradation. There are feudal societies that have destroyed their environment and their capacity to be sustained.
Like this?
It's a question of governance and creating the right rules so you get the right prices.
I don't think we disagree at all. And I'm talking about political economy, which is a great thing. We need political economy to attack this problem. And economics is a tool, and it can be a science. And it often is doing analysis, but values are part of it. So it is the dismal science because often values come into play and need to be evaluated. There's risk assessment. That's fairly scientific. Risk management is a political choice that has to do with values and how much you want to pay to be safe. So yes, political economy, but what I'm saying is that economics by and large defends capitalism, which I will repeat, is bad because I'm not talking about capital. Capital's great. That's the useful residue of human labor. I'm not even talking about the market because we need to trade our goods and services with each other because none of us does everything. I'm talking about power hierarchy and ownership. And that's where I think capitalism is evil because it allows the 1%, it allows 5% of this country to own things. It allows people to be in misery and say that that's normal. Well, that's just the market. These people must be weak-minded to be so poor. I mean, this is encoded in the decisions that we've made, in the laws that we've made. So we make new laws, and they have to be international laws. Which ones do we make, Mr. Economist, that would do it best and fastest? When it's a science fiction writer making it up, we're in terrible trouble because I'm just an English major. So we need that.
Gentleman, red sweater, yes.
When I hear you talking about sort of narrative impacts in the world, my mind immediately jumps to religion, and I'm sort of surprised that hasn't come up here. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about how sort of climate change narratives might intersect with various world religious narratives, as they are sort of groups that are renowned for finding a narrative to sort of real world impact.
No, all of the religions I know of always emphasize abstinence and all these things, and it never seems to work. So I'm not sure that they're all that effective, really. We sort of pay lip service to religions, then we go on and do whatever. I think Christianity is a peaceful religion. Who are we going to bomb next? I'm not sure that there are narratives there. I'm not sure that they're actually the ones that drive us, that make us move. It sort of feels like those are, I'm not sure if they maybe are myths that have lost their spell in a lot of ways, but they don't seem to be the ones that actually structure our behavior. Because if we look at sort of the ideals of almost any religion, you automatically find utopia, and yet we aren't in that space. I mean, that's just sort of my sort of cynical interpretation. Yeah, I don't know.
There are a lot of people, who have thought of this, who have said, okay, well, let's tap into these religious, this whole idea of creation care, for example, that we are stewards of the earth. God didn't really give us, dominion over all the animals. He put us here to, take care of them. I don't think that just from a practical standpoint, I know some of the people who were sort of on the vanguard of this, and I don't think from a practical standpoint you could say that they've gotten a lot of traction. They just always have been sort of marginal to mainstream religion, in this country. A lot of work was being done in the evangelical community, and those people sort of always remain marginal. I can't tell you why, what it was political as opposed to religious, I think. But I think it is a really interesting and potentially very powerful idea, one of the only countervailing forces to advertising, for example. But I haven't seen it get any real serious traction.
Terry?
What will be some of the benefits of climate change?
Later frost, crop increases. Some places, I think that people have to realize that we're not increasing the amount of sunlight that's falling on Earth, and we're not changing the distribution of sunlight. So you could think I'm not an agronomist, and if there is anyone in this world, but you're not moving. You can't really move your bread baskets north because they don't get as sun. They don't get direct sunlight the way you do in the tropics. So, in general, agricultural output there might be temporary gains in certain places, but in the long term, it's pretty negative. I think any agronomist would tell you that.
I always thought that there was an opportunity to short coastal land. Like, that was the one that I always, when people would sort of say, well, I don't really believe climate change exists. I'm like, great, I'd love to sell you some beachfront property. Yeah, let's do that.
Deals. Well, we use climate change as a metonymy or a synecdoche for environmental destruction on a larger scale. And like Betsy talking about ocean acidification, the death of the life in the oceans, and 1/3 of our food comes out of the oceans. So the temperature rising, it helps agriculture in a few places in the short run, but it also, more CO2 in the air is actually damaging to plants' uptake and their own photosynthesis. So in short, what I translate that to, what are the benefits of a mass extinction event? And I'm thinking, well, about 25 million years from now, we'll have a really interesting new ecology. So that's one of the benefits.
Lots of ecological niches opening up.
Ecological niches, rapid evolution, and the seagulls and the rats and the ants and the cockroaches. And if the sharks weren't being killed off, they would stick around.
Pardon.
Stan, I was really struck just with your comment about law and justice being a kind of technology. And I saw a TED Talk recently, I don't remember the guy's name, but he basically was arguing that all the enormous problems that we're facing in this country cannot even begin to be addressed until we get money out of politics. So, and suggesting, arguing very persuasively, that we need to figure out, well, which of these spectrum of problems we have to solve first. And he's arguing we can't solve any of it until we solve this problem, getting money out of politics. And then you mentioned zoning, and there's a great environmental documentary called Garbage Warrior about an architect who's building homes that can come off the grid, that collect rainfall for water, and are passively and actively solar, so they can get off the grid. And that the biggest problem he faced, and he was in New Mexico, from the state of New Mexico, was the zoning. Didn't allow him, it doesn't allow people to get off the grid. The whole legal structure is devoted towards not allowing people to get off the grid and build technologies that would, and it would be to everybody's benefit if people could come off the grid, because then they're fairly independent and so on and so forth. And also I'm just struck by where you live in Davis, California, Village Homes, is sort of a model community that hasn't been quite duplicated anywhere else, seemingly. Where it's mixed usage, where the zoning laws are segregating use in a way that actually is preventing certain kinds of sustainable intertwinements of usage. And so I just want to toss those issues out for comment.
I feel like the money in politics one is really, really powerful. I've been reading, a lot of the stuff that I've been doing in research recently has been reading about how corporations sort of subvert science, and particularly when they're working to defend a product. So if you're the tobacco industry, how you want to subvert the science that says that tobacco smoke is dangerous. If you're the lead industry, you want to subvert any kind of information that's saying that lead is dangerous. If you're the fossil fuel industry, you want to, it goes on and on. But there's sort of these very interesting sort of interplays between the lobbying money that they have, the advertising sort of clout that they have, the ability that they have to get inside of regulatory bodies and to influence who sits on a regulatory body, and then to pressure how those regulatory bodies both act and what kinds of ranges of authority that those regulatory bodies will have. And so it's sort of this moment where you start feeling like almost the entire structure of government is Potemkin, that it's the theory of laws and regulations, or it's the surface appearance of laws and regulations, while somebody else behind the curtain is simply moving a bunch of sort of things around to their own desires, while making it look like there are still laws that exist. And it's sort of this weird moment where you're like. And the thing that strikes me most is that we aren't outraged by the idea that money owns our government. That we can actually laugh at this, and that we're somehow inoculated to the idea that our government is genuinely corrupt at this point is amazing to me. It's like, oh yeah, those people in Washington, they're all bought. It's like, yes, that's right.
Yep.
And now, but where did our outrage go? We apparently have sort of fallen so far asleep that it's as though we can't wake up at all, that we've accepted the unacceptable. How did we let anybody take our government away from us? That's the one that,
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question to that, and that is, we've been talking about how you need to be transformational, we need to have these ideas, and really we can cut down on carbon if we use all these tools, and we need to change things now, we start now. And it seems to me that none of that is going to happen. We can't even run our government. We have the Tea Party to deal with. We have complete inability to even act on normal questions, not even to deal with these more difficult questions of how should we restrict our future economy or our present economy in order to save for the future. I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening under any scenario.
Oh.
let the utopian take that one.
Yeah, I'll take that one. You only need 51%. Sometimes you need 55%. Sometimes you need 6. Sometimes you need 60%. Rarely do you need more than 60% for legislative action. And it's still, at least in this country, a democratic government. China, another major player, is like 200 engineers who get to decide on their own. It's problematic, but it's always just politics. And you don't want to create a scenario of inevitability, like we can never beat big money, because in fact, in any given election, in California, we have a Democratic supermajority and a Democratic governor. It's not pure state, it's not utopia, but it is very encouraging, because it means that there's a residual island of reactionary people who would rather go down with the ship and their ideas than face reality. Well, you can outvote them if you get the word of mouth out there, if you create the story and the narrative, and if you believe it can happen. You still have to believe in politics. You still have to walk the streets. I mean, it's very grubby. It's very uninspirational, and really it needs the young generations to go out there idealistically and with some free time, perhaps even unemployed, to go out there and bash their heads against the wall for 5 or 10 years and then turn it over to the next generation. And everybody has to keep on voting and keep active and be a citizen. And then you can think, what's the whole American story been for? And of course, it's a global story, so it's really complicated. But we are the 25% of the world's carbon burn, so what we do matters. So I say, okay, now that we've got this horrifying situation in hand and this ridiculous culture, then you just go out and you say, you got to make the best of it. Yes. Mm-hmm. But is that so bad? I mean, what else are you going to do? But you certainly can't say, oh damn, we've just been defeated by the Tea Party, when that's 10% of the population of the country, and these are people that are dying quickly. They tend to be elderly, white people.
Barney Frank had this line, always used to use this line that says that, votes kick money's ass every time. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's just what Sam is saying. And I totally believe our politics are corrupt, and I totally believe that money runs Washington. I know money runs Washington. But people do still have the vote. Now, we unfortunately have a combination of a Supreme Court and a gerrymandered Congress. Those are, I'm sorry? Yes, but not the right one. And there's a huge time lag in the system. I mean, if you told me we have 50 years to work this out, I would say we will eventually get there, but we don't.
All right, gentleman in the back, lady in the front row.
Yes, hi. There's been some talk about narratives and your roles as storytellers, as well as being an English major. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michael Crichton's State of Fear, which is this thriller about how evil environmentalists want to destroy the world because
making up this thing
reasons.
called climate change.
And it comes with voluminous footnotes purporting to show that the hockey stick graph was a creation of villainous environmentalists. And I was wondering what you see in light of efforts like that as the limits and strengths of your roles as writers to effect change and to raise consciousness on this level. Are you limited as leaders in this by the fact that you're not personally scientists investigating, you're not climatologists?
Well, State of Fear is a great example because you cannot believe a single event that happens in that story. So when you read it, this is where the English major come through. You do a detailed textual analysis, sentence by sentence, in a kind of Delany-esque style, and each sentence falls apart. Could there be a conspiracy that stayed secret, through 50 years that involved every scientist on the planet? Well, no, but let's go on to the next unbelievable bit. And so this is a truly bad novel, and the fact that George W. Bush celebrated it is hilarious. And at that point, maybe you're back to Dr. Strangelove, where this is something that's so bad that it's funny, and it might rebound against itself because this is a spectacularly bad novel. And of course celebrated by our president. It got this guy an hour in the office with the president. It was so bad. Well, this is kind of great. This is amazing. This is the power of stories. I mean, the person that tells the stories rules the world, or poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And really the important word there is unacknowledged, because they never really are acknowledged. But that's okay. You don't need to be acknowledged. You just go ahead and tell the stories and hope that yours is more plausible. Then it requires good writing, good art. Maybe you could say the best art's going to win, but that's like saying the best politics is going to win. It's a utopian statement.
I feel like one of the things that Crichton had going for him that he was affirming the status quo, and that's a hugely seductive thing. And so whenever you're going to write something that affirms the status quo and says, "Hey, you're fine. You're a good person sitting there in your chair. You're decent and human, and it's those fucking environmentalists who are just trying to mess up your TV shows." That's the problem here. I think that when you're coming from that perspective of writing art that assuages the reader, you've always got a leg up. I think that it's not. I think that the goal, when you're doing the opposite, where you're trying to find some discomfort in the reader or trying to create some sort of change in the reader, is that you're trying to find some kind of judo maneuver that will catch them off balance and be able to pull them somehow to see something differently, and suddenly, to twist their world enough that they suddenly wake up, that they are no longer comfortable, but they're glad. And I feel like I'm still hunting for that judo move. I think it's out there. But what Crichton's doing, the reason why his stuff works so well is because it's so affirming of you don't have to change a thing. I think it's.
Yeah, and I would just add, I completely agree. Then I would just add that also has very vast political dimensions. We're not just talking about narrative here. I mean, there are reasons why those narratives are politically very effective, and so I think the whole thing comes full circle. I mean, it's not just we're not just fighting some moneyed interest. We're actually fighting the fact that people are perfectly comfortable with how they live, and on some level I don't blame all of us for being perfectly comfortable how we live, but to fight that is to fight this narrative that we all tell ourselves. And as as Paolo said before, people don't really like to be told that what they're doing is completely wrong. It's not a way to win friends and influence people. And so that I think is the really, when you get down to the heart of the matter, that is the fundamental problem. We're all implicated in this. We all have to take, responsibility, to use that horrible word, and it's not a happy message.
I actually think that is one of the spots where religion is sort of interesting, as I've watched sort of the evangelical organizations sort of like, pulling young people in as God's warriors. And these are horrifying messages. I've seen these YouTube videos and stuff like kids, like, I'm going out to fight for God, and like, create good values and da-da-da-da. But it's interesting because, essentially they're selecting for a lifestyle that's less fun. And religion has succeeded in making them excited about it, and because it's pushing other buttons of being connected to people, of being connected to their group, of doing the right fight, of fighting the good fight. And some of those things are very interesting. I think that those things can be manipulated in very, very dangerous ways. But there are certain impulses, right? And there are, they certainly have. But there are certain human impulses that we do want to fight the good fight. There are narratives that we want to, be on the right side of history, or have be able to, lay down at night knowing that we've been the good ones. And those things can be, those things can feed us far more sometimes than whether or not we got the next iPad.
Yeah, this chimes in with something I've been trying to say for a long time, which is that happiness and healthiness are almost synonymous. So that the healthier you live, the happier you get. And a healthy lifestyle, as the Paleolithic humans that we are, with the DNA and the evolutionary history that we have, the lifestyle that keeps us healthiest is kind of a low-carbon burn relative to the other lifestyle of the American consumerism. So it's not just religious renunciation where the older generation says, oh, we torched the planet, sorry, now you have to live like saints and it's not going to be fun for you anymore. It's more the young saying, you folks were idiots with this hyper-consumerism. You got taken, what a scam. You're all, you're all dying of diseases of overconsumption. And it's so much more stylish, as well as healthier and happier, to run this life that it costs less money, costs less carbon. And so it becomes a positive thing, a stylish thing, as opposed to the bloated. You begin to think that all of American culture was like an SUV or a 1950s Cadillac with fins, something relatively bloated and stupid, whereas the new style is cleaner and more stylish.
More elegant.
And it costs less of your life, and you end up healthier and therefore happier. So that this becomes a project. So then it becomes existentialism again, because the main thing about existentialism is where there's no meaning, you have to make up your own meaning. Well, what's the meaning? Well, you try to live a good life. Well, what's a good life? Well, you make a sustainable civilization. And how do you do that? You live in a low-carbon burn way. And then this becomes a religion. And it's sort of a scientifically, it's a sort of a citizenship religion, a secular religion, but it's a value system, if that's what a religion is. It binds people together. So it has to be a generational thing. And if I tell you what, if even a sizable counterculture of young people are doing something, it catches on and becomes the norm. This is the way the generations work. So it's that stylishness that I try to point out in the Burning Less Carbon project for Americans. It's what we can do as Americans, is try to define a better style.
So I'd like to ask each of you to select one of your published works that actually has the potential to affect consciousness raising, and talk about why.
Sure.
Yikes. Yes, I would like you to read the complete works. You know what?
Consume all of them multiple times. It would be great.
I'm going to say 2312, a novel of mine called 2312, in terms of consciousness changing and bringing up all these issues and being both utopian and dystopian, a real mess, a novel. So I'll say 2312.
Wow, I don't know. Exactly. I don't pick one. Yeah. I've only written one book, and it really started as a series of articles, and it was supposed to, freak people out. How's that? So that's whether it did or not, I apparently not quite enough. Not quite enough. We're all still here.
I mean, 700,000 people every week for years changing consciousness. You have a very appreciative audience.
We're your fans.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, everything that I'm writing is trying to do that, but my latest one is Zombie Baseball Beatdown. And you think that's a joke, but it's a story for kids, and it's a story for 8 to 12-year-olds, and it's about where the zombie apocalypse comes from, and it's meatpacking plants. It's coming out of infected meatpacking plants, and so it's an opportunity for kids to go inside of a meatpacking plant and see how industrial meat gets prepared from feedlot to slaughter to everything else, and they get to beat the knees off of zombies at the same time. But it's very much a consciousness raising project, and aimed at people who actually have the potential to care. And so that was, that's my latest.
But also Shipbreaker.
Oh yeah, Shipbreaker. Yeah.
Paolo Bacigalupi. I recommend that one very much.
Several of you discussed technological solutions to the problems of not just of environmental degradation, but also the capitalism that produces it or that fosters it. And I guess I was wondering about the connections between capitalism and scientific development. I spent half my week among scientists in Cambridge, where the gutters flow with venture capital, and everyone's talking about how to monetize any idea that they come up with. And it seems to me that science, sort of divorced from capitalism, is
No, I wanted to contest that, but I will say this. Capitalism, as defined as that power hierarchy of ownership, it can buy economics as a discipline. It can buy the political system as a system. It can buy laws for itself, and it can buy science. And science began with the gun to its head, to Galileo's head. Science began, bought, and broke, and looking for funding. So, think of it in terms of the commons and enclosure, so that science, if it is a utopian effort to make life better, can always be privatized, which is enclosure. And that when the enclosure happened was when the great revolutions happened. You get enclosure and suddenly the immiserated are willing to go knock things over. And at that point you get the great revolutions in democratic government. So I'm saying democracy is the virtual commons. And I'm saying that science is a public utility of the virtual commons that is democratic government. It can be bought because we're seeing this battle. The enclosure effort never stops. The defense of the commons never stops. But since science is trying to do good in the world, except of course when it's bought for war purposes, which often happens, since everything's purchasable, or money is the universal solvent, and can melt values, it seems. So this is an ongoing battle, but again, and we're seeing the privatization of science. It's really scary in drug trials right now, where I don't know if that's the industry you're talking about, but in drug trials in particular, there's only funding for the drug trials that encourage us to think that we need drugs even to stay healthy. And there may come a moment where insurance companies require you to take drugs just to get insurance. So in other words, health is an economic factoid rather than a feeling. And so I think you're identifying a battlefield, but I don't think that the war is over. It's just another battlefield.
Yeah,
Two more questions.
Science is just a. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. No, go.
No, I was just
please.
going to say science is just, a methodology. I mean, what is science? What is science? Science has brought us a million things that, most people in this room would say are good, and a million things that many of us would say are terrible. It's just an experimental method. It has no content, really, does it? I mean,
yes, of course, but science takes funding, and funding comes from either,
No, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
Since World War II, funding has come from the federal government, the National Science Foundation. In other words, the people's company. Science is also a commons and a public endeavor until it gets privatized. It's not. Funding doesn't mean corruption, because funding can be the commons of people as a public utility doing things for everybody together. That's called tax and spend. So this is what I'm saying.
Well, gentleman on the aisle.
So I've noticed this problem where we live our common lives, and then there's this other stuff that we have to worry about, and it's really difficult to deal about it because you have to deal with your common life. So how do you go about it trying to figure out this extra stuff when you have to feed your family and just continue to live on a daily basis? Like you have school or you have pressing issues at hand, and then it seems like everything else that's on top like shouldn't be your responsibility. How do you change that attitude to make that also a priority, or to incorporate it into your life?
Oh, thanks. Because I talk all the time. Okay, I actually think I think that a lot of it has to do with actually trying to find ways to release yourself from the buy-in that certain things actually equal the good life, and trying to redefine what the good life is. Because, yeah, there are certain things that we're doing to feed our family, but there are also certain things that we're doing to live in the stylish neighborhood, or there are certain things that we're doing to have the right kind of car, or to get the new iPad, or whatever that thing is. And there is a process of identifying need versus want, and specifically in the United States, there is some gap between what we need and what we want, and we've often mistaken our wants for our needs. I remember the moment when I lived in China for a while working, and I remember the moment when I came back to my parents' 2,000 square foot house. That my father and my stepmother lived in after being in an apartment in Beijing with a family of 6 that had 2 rooms and was made out of concrete, and the need versus want sort of gap there was so vast that that there's some sort of reality check there, even in our daily lives, to sort of start saying, what do we need versus what do we want? I mean, one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to become a novelist, which meant that I had to figure out how to live on a lot less. And because being a novelist was far more important than having a nice car. And it's interesting because that also means that I have the good life, because I get to do the things, because I'm not chasing on a hamster wheel to make enough money. It means that I'm actually chasing on a hamster wheel to get the most satisfaction from my life, which is a far more interesting project. One of my friends, who lives very, very inexpensively. She lives off the grid in western Colorado with her husband, and they built their house by hand. And there's a certain myth of the frontier that we're going to just accept here for the moment, because there's some other things I think are really interesting, because they decided to live very, very small with their one solar panel. That sometimes it gets a little dark in the winter, and with their very, very small house made out of straw bale, and their very, very tiny refrigerator. All of those decisions mean that she can both work as an environmental journalist and pursue only the stories that she cares about. She doesn't have to write for Vogue or Oprah or any of the other trashy magazines. She can just focus on the stories she cares about, because those are sufficient to feed her and her family. There are some things that you get in return for untethering from the sort of the hamster wheel of sort of desire for stuff. And I think it is possible to do. I think it takes awareness to start paying attention to the difference between those things, and you can start bringing your life into alignment, and you get closer to the idea of, her comment was always, you be poor to live rich, because what you get back in return for not working as hard on the hamster wheel is you get your life. And it's always been a very powerful thing to me, is how much do you want to work? I used to know a guy who ran an organic apple juice factory, basically, and there was a point where he could have expanded beyond what he had. He was already selling successfully, he was already in a bunch of supermarkets, and he had the opportunity to sell to Whole Foods. And he didn't, and I was like, you're insane, you could make more money if you just go into Whole Foods, they want you. And he says, yeah, but then I'd have to work more than 4 days a week. It's like, holy shit, wait, you're going to value something more than money? Your life? What is that thing? And I think there are paths.
Yeah, that's that stylishness, and I would only add to that, just agreeing with everything Paolo said, that the stylish life is low carbon burn and gets you more freedom and a richer life, but also that this problem of creating a sustainable civilization is a broadband, long-term problem that will take work in every discipline. So that especially for college students, you can kind of look around and say, well, what is the green job? It can be in engineering or environmental work or in political science or in economics or in the arts and the humanities to get the word out and tell the stories. So in other words, if you're still choosing a career, you can actually choose a green career or a permaculture career, and then you become part of this project by your direct work as well. So as a producer as well as a consumer, you end up doing this kind of thing. And mindful consumption is the Dalai Lama saying another wise thing, that we're all going to consume, but if you pay attention to what's really making you healthy and happy, you make different consumption choices, different production choices. It's a way of looking at it that I think can influence behaviors. In the back.
Yeah, I think you have something there with your ideas about an antagonism between science and capitalism. One of the nice things about science fiction is that it engenders a real long-term view of the human endeavor. If you read the Asimov's Foundation trilogy, you're talking about millennia between, when this happens and this something else happens, the mule comes along, and you have Harry Seldon, the prophetic fellow who's known as a psychohistorian, who's able to see all this stuff way into the future and plan, put Trantor beyond scrutiny and by following this sort of recipe and the other one. And when I was reading science fiction back in the 60s, I developed this sort of way of looking at things, as I think a lot of other people did. And the thinking back then was, well, we have enough fossil fuel for maybe a couple hundred years, maybe 700, maybe 1,000, and then, well, we've got enough uranium in the crust because they did the Murray survey and they did all these other atomic energy surveys that said, well, we've got, maybe 2,500 years worth of fissile materials, and we will then be able to last, human civilization will be able to go that far. But then what happened was we came along with this interrupt, which is this problem of global warming. I don't like to use the word climate change because I think that's a euphemism that we've been forced into by trying to be polite to the other side. We should call things by their right name. It's anthropogenic global warming that we're all concerned about. So, getting back to your idea of this possible antagonism between science and capitalism. So, I don't think you can make the leap, as you were trying to suggest, to a nuclear-powered world. If you look at what happens to those free neutrons and the way they irradiate things and make them radioactive for so very long, and you look at accidents like Fukushima, for instance, I think that you'll soon discover that you don't need that. Solar power is so good now, and the sun is going to last for billions of years, that there's no reason why we just don't jump directly to solar power. And I used to think, and I'm sure a lot of other people did too, that it just takes too much area. Well, if you look at some research that's been done recently by some German researchers, they've actually plotted the amount of area that we need to devote to these terribly inefficient solar cells using present technology. And it isn't that much. Could I finish? Please. What I'm getting at is, if you do that, you jump to solar power, you make an initial capital investment, there is no operating cost. You have to clean them every once in a while, but there's no fuel cost. So you might get to a situation where there would be nobody making enormous profits from this kind of thing. There might be the old idea of too cheap to meter energy that was out there, that was clean and providing all of our civilizational needs all around the world with, a little bit of wind and hydro and stuff here and there. The problem with that is, like you were saying before, we know how to solve this global warming problem. It's not a question of technology. It's a question of political will and maybe metaphysical evil. maybe there are forces out there, like capitalism, like what he was saying, capitalism isn't bad. If you read the Chaucer's tale, they discussed whether money was evil. They said, no, this is Chaucer. He talked about whether money was evil. No, it's not money that's evil, it's the love of money that's evil. Well, capitalism is a system which is founded on the love of money.
All right, thank you. Yeah. No, appreciate it. Yeah.
Although I will say I agree with everything you said, and in the tradition of the Science Fiction Convention, which we are at Hartwell Con, that this is the traditional ending of the panel discussion.